By 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the center of Europe like a force of nature. Austria had been crushed. Prussia had collapsed in weeks. Russia had been forced to negotiate. 3 coalitions had broken against him in less than 3 years. But here's the hardcore truth. Napoleon was not simply winning because he was a genius. He was winning because he had built something Europe had never seen before. A new kind of war machine. Most history books simplify it. They say Napoleon moved faster. That's only half true. He moved faster because he fundamentally redesigned how armies functioned. He replaced the slow, rigid armies of the 18th century with a modular system built for speed, flexibility, and concentration of force. The Grande Armée. And for a brief moment in history, it was nearly unstoppable. But every system has assumptions. Every machine is designed for a specific environment. Napoleon built a war machine designed for Europe. In Russia, Europe ended. Tonight, we are not just talking about battles. We are talking about systems, logistics, communication, roads, food, distance, and how the greatest military machine on Earth slowly began to consume itself. Before Napoleon, European armies behaved like gigantic moving fortresses. One massive body, slow, rigid, difficult to control. If an army of 80,000 men needed to change direction, the entire column had to pivot together. Supply wagons stretched for miles. Orders moved slowly. Everything depended on centralized control. It was powerful, but clumsy. Napoleon changed all of that. Instead of one giant army, he divided his forces into independent corps. Each corps was essentially a miniature army, 20 to 40,000 men, its own infantry, its own cavalry, its own artillery, its own commanders, its own operational flexibility. And most importantly, each corps could survive alone long enough for the others to arrive. Napoleon summarized the doctrine in one sentence. March separately, fight combined. This was revolutionary. Instead of clogging a single road, the Grande Armée spread across entire regions. The corps moved separately to increase speed and reduce supply pressure. Then, at the decisive moment, they converged with terrifying force. Napoleon often arranged them in what historians call the bataillon carré, a giant moving diamond across the landscape. If one corps was attacked, it could hold for roughly 24 hours. Within that time, the surrounding corps would collapse inward from multiple directions. What looked scattered suddenly became concentrated violence. This system gave Napoleon operational speed Europe could barely comprehend. But the core system depended on invisible foundations. Good roads, dense farmland, fast communication, reliable local supplies. The army moved quickly because it carried less food. French soldiers lived off the land. In Germany and northern Italy, this worked brilliantly. Troops spread through rich farmland and returned with grain, cattle, bread, wine, and fodder. The land fed the machine. But what happens when the land has nothing left to give? The core system also required something else, an entirely new level of command and control. Napoleon could not personally direct every movement across hundreds of miles, so he relied on one of the most important men in the empire, Louis-Alexandre Berthier. Berthier was not a battlefield genius. He was something far rarer, a translator of genius. Napoleon's thoughts moved rapidly and chaotically. Berthier transformed those thoughts into precise written orders. Routes, timetables, coordinates, march speeds, supply instructions. Without Berthier, the machine struggled to function. This was the birth of modern military bureaucracy. But even perfect orders require functioning roads, functioning couriers, functioning supply lines. And in 1808, Napoleon invaded a country that shattered all three. In 1808, Napoleon made one of the greatest mistakes of his career. He invaded Spain. At first, it looked easy. The Spanish monarchy collapsed quickly. French troops occupied Madrid. Napoleon believed the campaign would be little more than a political correction. Instead, Spain became a slow-moving catastrophe. Napoleon later called it the Spanish ulcer. And the name was perfect, because ulcers do not kill instantly. They drain strength slowly, relentlessly. The first problem was geography. The core system depended on fertile land. Spain was different. Large regions of the Iberian Peninsula were dry, mountainous, and sparsely populated. French troops marched for days through barren plateaus with little food and poor roads. If the army stayed concentrated, it starved. If it dispersed to forage, it became vulnerable. And then came something Napoleon had never truly faced before. Not an army, a population. The word guerrilla was born here. Little war. Spanish fighters attacked couriers, supply wagons, small detachments, isolated patrols. Church bells warned villages before French troops arrived. Roads became death traps. In Germany, a courier could deliver orders in hours. In Spain, couriers sometimes required cavalry escorts hundreds of men strong. And even then, many never arrived. The communication system began breaking down. The corps stopped functioning as connected parts of a larger whole. They became isolated islands surrounded by hostility. One French officer described entire roads lined with dead horses, burned wagons, and mutilated stragglers. This was no longer gentlemanly European warfare. It was attrition, hatred, ambush, and slow exhaustion. Spain consumed men endlessly. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of French troops would disappear into the peninsula. Elite veterans, experienced officers, some of Napoleon's best marshals. While Napoleon dreamed of Moscow, Spain was already bleeding the empire to death from below. Then came the warning. The War of the Fifth Coalition. The Austrians had been studying Napoleon carefully. They began reorganizing their own armies along corps lines. Europe was learning. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling, Napoleon attempted to cross the Danube River near Vienna. But disaster struck. Floodwaters destroyed the bridges connecting his forces. Entire corps became trapped, separated, unable to reinforce one another properly. For the first time in nearly a decade, Napoleon suffered a major battlefield defeat. And the cost was personal. Jean Lannes, one of his closest friends and finest marshals, was mortally wounded. Napoleon reportedly wept beside him. But the deeper warning was strategic. The gap between France and the rest of Europe was shrinking. Napoleon still won campaigns, but increasingly through massive artillery concentration and brute force. Less through maneuver, less through elegance. The god of war was slowly becoming a sledgehammer. But the real disaster hadn't even begun. Because Napoleon had built a machine designed for Europe. In Russia, Europe disappeared. And soon, the greatest army on earth would enter a country so vast that even victory